Then he turned to Aaliyah, his expression softening in a way that told a different story entirely, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle, protective, and said words that landed like thunder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" And the room froze because the tone wasn't political, it wasn't performative, it was unmistakably paternal, and Halvorsen laughed again, too loudly, saying, "Wait, what is this, you know her?" And the governor nodded once and said clearly, "Yes." And then after a pause, that felt like a verdict being read, he added, "That's my daughter." And something inside Halvorsen broke, the color draining from his face so fast it was almost comical, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a script that no longer existed, because suddenly the narrative he'd been writing collapsed, and all the power he thought he had evaporated under the weight of reality, and the silence in the room grew heavy, oppressive, and then it happened, not metaphorically but literally. Dark stains spreading down the front of Halvorsen's khaki pants as his body betrayed him. The ultimate humiliation. The kind you can't badge your way out of, and gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone snorted despite themselves. Someone else turned away in secondhand embarrassment, and the governor didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He simply looked at the officer and said, "You're done here?" And Halvorsen stammered, trying to explain, to apologize, words tripping over each other. But the damage was already complete, because this wasn't just about one party, one insult, one man losing control. It was about exposure, about the mask slipping, and as security escorted Halvorsen out, his shoes squeaking faintly against the floor, Aaliyah felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion, because even now the room buzzed more about his fall than her pain, and later, when the party resumed in a muted, awkward way, she stepped out onto the balcony with her father, the city lights, blinking like distant witnesses, and he apologized to her, not for what happened but for the world that made moments like that possible. And she told him she was tired of being strong all the time, and he told her she didn't have to be strong alone, and the next morning the story exploded online, headlines reducing it to spectacle, memes mocking the officer, debates raging about race, power, and accountability, and within days an internal investigation was launched, body cam footage from a different incident resurfaced, complaints that had been buried suddenly unearthed, and Halvorsen's career unraveled thread by thread, while Aaliyah, instead of hiding, chose to speak, not as a governor's daughter but as a woman who refused to be silent, and in interviews she talked about how humiliation had been a weapon used against her long before that party, how authority without empathy was just another form of violence, and people listened, really listened, because the story was no longer about a man who peed himself in disgrace. It was about a system that had been exposed in the most human, humiliating way possible, and months later, when reforms were proposed and training overhauled and apologies issued, Aaliyah stood at a podium beside her father and said that accountability wasn't revenge, it was responsibility, and that dignity should never depend on who your parents are, and somewhere out there, stripped of uniform and illusion, Halvorsen had to live with the moment his power failed him, while Aaliyah moved forward, not defined by the night she was humiliated, but by the day the truth spoke louder than fear. Tive paragraph. The night was supposed to be harmless, the kind of rooftop party that floats above the city like it owes nothing to the streets below. Music thumping against the skyline, laughter spilling over the edges of polished glass railings, and people dressed like consequences didn't exist. And that was exactly why Aaliyah came, not to belong but to breathe, because she was tired of shrinking herself in rooms that demanded gratitude just for entry, tired of being the only black woman who had to smile twice as hard to be seen as half as welcome. So she wore a simple black dress and her confidence like armor, unaware that Officer Mark Halvorsen had already noticed her the moment she stepped off the elevator. His badge clipped proudly to his belt even though he was off duty. His voice already loud with liquor and entitlement, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny, scanning the crowd not for joy but for dominance, and when his eyes landed on Aaliyah something dark flickered behind them, not desire but suspicion, the kind that has followed black women for generations. And when she brushed past him to reach the drink table he muttered something about "watch it," loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to pretend it was nothing, and she ignored it because she'd learned long ago that survival often meant silence. But silence has a way of fermenting, and the next time their paths crossed he blocked her way with a grin that pretended to be playful, asking whose party it was, like she was trespassing in her own evening, and when she calmly replied that she was invited, he laughed and said, "Yeah, Sure you were. And people nearby shifted uncomfortably, the music still pounding as if it could drown out reality, and Aaliyah felt that familiar heat rise in her chest, the memory of every time she'd been asked to prove she belonged, every time her presence had been treated like a crime scene, and she said, evenly, that she didn't need to explain herself to him, which was, when he decided to make a show of it, raising his voice, joking that maybe security should check her bag, that these parties attracted all kinds, and the word hung there, unfinished but fully understood, and laughter sputtered, nervous and thin, and someone tried to change the subject, but Halvorsen was already drunk on the attention, puffing his chest, flashing his badge like a magic spell that excused cruelty, and when Aaliyah told him to back off he stepped closer instead, invading her space, telling her to calm down, that she was getting aggressive. And that single word cracked the room open because it was the oldest trick in the book, paint her as a threat, rewrite the script so he was the hero, and when she tried to walk away he grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to leave a mark but firm enough to remind her of his power. And that was when the party finally noticed, conversation stalling, eyes turning, phones lowering, and Aaliyah said loudly, clearly, "Don't touch me," and Halvorsen scoffed, releasing her like he was doing her a favor, announcing to the room that some people needed to learn respect, that his job was to keep people safe, and the irony of it almost made her laugh, almost, but instead she felt something steadier settle inside her. A calm that came from knowing something he didn't, because while he was busy performing authority, she was remembering her father's voice telling her never to beg for dignity, and she straightened her shoulders and said, "You're embarrassing yourself?" And the room went quiet in that dangerous way, the way it does right before something irreversible happens, and Halvorsen's face flushed, anger and alcohol mixing into a volatile brew, and he sneered that she should leave before things got complicated, that he could make one call and ruin her night, her week, her life. And that's when a man at the edge of the crowd cleared his throat, a tall man with silver hair and a presence that didn't demand attention, but commanded it, who had been watching silently until now, and he said calmly, "Officer, that won't be necessary." And Halvorsen turned, annoyed at the interruption, asking who the hell he was, and the man stepped forward into the light, and several people recognized him at once, a ripple of whispers spreading like electricity, because this wasn't just any guest, this was Governor James Carter, the kind of name that carried weight even in rooms built on ego, and Halvorsen's confidence wavered, for just a second before he recovered, laughing awkwardly, saying he didn't know the governor was here, that he was just handling a situation, and the governor looked at him with something colder than anger, something like disappointment sharpened into steel, and said, "I've been watching the situation, and